The laughter at the dinner table was supposed to feel like home until it turned into a firing squad of mockery. My own parents led the charge, dismissing my service, my rank, and the uniform I'd nearly died to earn. But they didn't know one thing. The man sitting quietly at the other end of that table, our base commander, knew exactly who I was. And when he stood up, the whole room went silent. My name is Lena Crawford, and I've flown helicopters through sandstorms that could strip paint off metal, but nothing prepared me for the way my own family could strip away my dignity with just words. The humid Florida evening clung to everything like a second skin as I pulled into my parents' driveway. The familiar sight of their coastal home near MacDill should have brought comfort, but my stomach tightened instead. Through the kitchen window, I could already see the gathering relatives, neighbors, some faces I recognized from the base. Mom had called it a little reunion barbecue, but her little gatherings had a way of becoming performances where I was always cast as the disappointment. The smell of charcoal and grilled meat hit me as I walked through the gate. Dad stood at the grill, his retired airman posture still intact after 15 years, wearing that same Tampa Bay Buccaneers apron he'd had since I was 12. He glanced up, saw my civilian clothes, and his face did that thing, that slight downturn at the corners of his mouth that said I wasn't quite what he'd hoped for. "Well, look who decided to show up," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Our desk jockey finally escaped from her computer. The laughter rippled through the yard, harmless to anyone who didn't know our history. But I knew. Every joke was a paper cut, and he'd been making them for years. "Hi, Dad." I kept my voice level, neutral. I'd learned long ago that defending myself only gave him more ammunition. Mom appeared from the house, carrying a pitcher of sweet tea, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the humidity. "Lena, honey, you look tired. All those long hours staring at screens?" She didn't wait for an answer, turning to Mrs. Henderson from next door. "She works in logistics now. Very safe. Very administrative." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Administrative. As if the medal recommendations in my service record were for exceptional filing skills. I found an empty chair near the edge of the patio and sat down, letting the conversation flow around me. My brother Evan would show up eventually, loud and brash in his Marine reservist glory, ready to dominate the conversation with stories from his one deployment to Kuwait, where he'd never left the base. The other guests mingled, drinks in hand, the conversation a comfortable buzz of base gossip and football predictions. Then I noticed him, a man in his 50s, silver at his temples, sitting quietly at the far end of the table. Something about his posture, the way he held his beer bottle with precise control, screamed military even in civilian clothes. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave the slightest nod. I didn't recognize him, but something in that acknowledgement felt different from the dismissive glances I'd been getting all evening. Dad raised his voice again, this time addressing the whole gathering. "You know, back in my day, Air Force meant something. We didn't hide behind technology. We got our hands dirty." He looked directly at me. "Now it's all drones and computers. Hell, Lena here probably hasn't even seen the inside of a cockpit in years." The fury started in my chest, a familiar burn I'd learned to contain. My fingers found the condensation on my water glass, tracing patterns while I counted breaths. 1, 2, 3. The silence stretched, everyone waiting for my response. "She's doing important work," the quiet man at the end of the table said, his voice carrying despite its soft tone. "All roles serve a purpose." Dad waved him off. Sure. But it's not the same as real service, is it? Not like the boys flying combat missions or boots on the ground?" He raised his beer, grinning at the crowd. "Here's to our daughter, the Air Force administrator." The toast went up, glasses clinking, laughter echoing across the yard. I stood slowly, my legs steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Excuse me," I said to no one in particular and walked toward the house. Behind me, I heard Mom's stage whisper. She's always been sensitive about her career. I keep telling her there's no shame in support roles. I stopped at the back door, my hand on the handle, and looked back. The quiet man was watching me, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that looked like understanding, or maybe recognition. Then Evan's truck roared into the driveway, and the moment shattered. I went inside, letting the air conditioning wash over me, and stood at the kitchen sink looking out at my family's celebration. They were still laughing, still toasting, still convinced that everything I'd done, everything I'd survived, could be reduced to a desk job. They had no idea who I really was, but someone at that table did, and somehow, that made their mockery even harder to bear. The drive back to my apartment stretched through empty streets slick with evening rain. My uniform hung in the back seat, pressed and perfect, the captain's insignia catching streetlight through the plastic garment bag. 20 minutes from my parents' house to my place. But tonight it felt like crossing between two different worlds. I couldn't shake the weight of their words. Administrator, desk jockey, support role. Each one clung to me like the humidity, seeping through my defenses. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the memories pushed through memories they'd never bothered to ask about. Syria. 2 years ago. The sandstorm had come out of nowhere, turning day into a brown nightmare of swirling grit and zero visibility. My crew chief's voice crackled through the headset. Ghost Hawk 1, we've lost visual on the crash site. But we couldn't abort. 12 soldiers were down there, their Black Hawk nothing but twisted metal in hostile territory. The sand scoured our windshield, instruments screaming warnings, turbulence throwing us around like a toy. My co-pilot was praying under his breath, but my hands stayed steady on the controls. That's what they never understood in those moments. There was no room for fear, only the mission. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling me back to the present. Colonel Hayes. I pulled into my parking space and answered. Crawford, you missed a hell of an exit tonight. His gravelly voice filled the car. Heard Evan showed up after you left and spent an hour telling everyone about his combat experience organizing supply runs. Sir, I didn't know you were. I wasn't. But General Reed called me after, said he met you at your folks' place. Interesting choice of dinner guest for a family barbecue. My breath caught. General Reed, the quiet man at the end of the table. The base commander himself had sat there, listening to my father toast my imaginary desk job. Sir, I had no idea. Of course you didn't. You were too busy taking hits from your own family to notice much of anything. His tone softened. Listen, Crawford, I'm calling about the ceremony next week. Your nomination for the Distinguished Flying Cross went through. Full honors. The Secretary of the Air Force will be there. I slumped back in the driver's seat. The Distinguished Flying Cross. For heroism or extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. The same medal my father had spent years telling people he should have gotten in Vietnam. Sir, my parents, have already been invited. Protocol demands it. I'm sorry, Crawford. I know that's not ideal given tonight's performance. But they'll think it's for pushing paperwork. The words came out bitter, exhausted. They'll stand there and smile for photos and still think I'm playing soldier from behind a desk. Hayes was quiet for a moment. You know what you did out there. We know. The 12 soldiers you pulled out of that hellhole know. Isn't that enough? No one at home would care. I said it without thinking, the truth slipping out raw and unfiltered. Crawford, Lena, you saved lives. You flew into conditions that would have grounded most pilots, took fire from 3 different positions, and still got everyone out. You think your medals came from paperwork? They came from blood and courage and skill that maybe 5 pilots in the entire Air Force could have pulled off. I stared at my apartment building through the rain-streaked windshield. 2nd floor, 3rd window from the left, my living room light was on, set to a timer so I wouldn't come home to darkness. Such a small comfort. But tonight, even that felt hollow. Sir, they're never going to see me as anything more than that's their loss, Captain. But you'll be at that ceremony, and you'll wear your uniform with pride. and you'll accept that medal because you damn well earned it. Clear. Yes, sir. Good. Get some rest. And Crawford, stop letting them define your worth. You're Ghost Hawk 1. You've faced worse than family disappointment and survived. He hung up, leaving me alone in the car with the rain drumming on the roof. I grabbed my uniform from the back seat and ran for the building entrance. The garment bag clutched against my chest like armor. Inside my apartment, I hung the uniform in the closet and stood there looking at it. The ribbons were perfectly aligned, each one a story my family had never asked to hear. The Air Medal with Valor Device, the Air Force Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device. Tomorrow, I'd drive back to Wrighton Air Station, back to the world where my call sign meant something, where the scars on my hands from wrestling damaged controls through a sandstorm were badges of honor instead of shame. But tonight, I sat on my couch in the dark, wondering if the loneliness of being a hero nobody believed in was worse than being nobody at all. Outside, the rain kept falling, and somewhere across the city, my family was probably still laughing, still toasting their administrator daughter who played it safe, who chose the easy path, who would never understand real service. They were wrong, but being right had never felt so empty. The gates of Wrighton Air Station appeared through the morning mist like a portal to the only world that made sense anymore. I showed my ID to the airman at the gate, who snapped to attention when he saw my rank. Morning, Captain Crawford. Here, that title meant something. The base hummed with its usual rhythm jets taking off in the distance, the steady thrum of military precision that had become my heartbeat. I parked outside the operations building and walked through the halls I'd memorized years ago, past photos of aircraft and crews, past the Wall of Honor where fallen pilots smiled forever young. Colonel Hayes was waiting in his office, coffee already poured, that knowing look on his weathered face. But he wasn't alone. General Marcus Reed stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, studying the flight line. Captain Crawford reporting as ordered, sir. I saluted, my body falling into the familiar comfort of protocol. Reed turned, and I recognized him clearly now, the quiet observer from my parents' barbecue. Up close, his eyes held the steady calm of someone who'd seen too much to be rattled by anything. At ease, Captain. His voice carried the same quiet authority from last night. Coffee. Thank you, sir. Hayes poured while Reed studied me. Your father served under me briefly in '91. Good mechanic. Terrible poker player. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. He never mentioned his daughter flew rescue ops in Syria. He doesn't know the details, sir. The coffee burned my throat, but I welcomed the distraction. I don't share much. Ghost Hawk 1. Reed said my call sign like he was tasting it. You know why they gave you that name? Because I flew night extractions, sir. No. He moved to a map on the wall, fingers tracing over Middle Eastern territories. Because you appeared out of nowhere when people had given up hope, pulled them from the dead, then vanished. The Syrians thought you were a myth. Some of our own people did too, until they saw the rescue reports. Hayes cleared his throat. Sir, about the ceremony. Her parents will be there. Reed's tone was matter of fact. Front row, as protocol demands. I understand that presence. Complications. I set down my coffee cup, choosing my words carefully. Sir, they're going to make this about them. My mother will tell everyone it's for administrative excellence. My father will find a way to minimize. Your father will stand there and watch his daughter receive one of the highest honors in military aviation. Reed's voice carried an edge now. What he does with that moment is his choice. With respect, sir. You saw last night. They've already made their choice. Reed walked closer, and I could see the calculation in his eyes, the strategic mind that had earned him his stars. Captain, do you know what I saw last night? Sir, I saw an officer maintain bearing under hostile fire, not from enemies, but from family, which is infinitely harder. I saw discipline, restraint, and dignity in the face of ignorance. He paused. But I also saw something else you've been silent for so long. They've mistaken it for acceptance. The words hit like a physical blow. I wanted to argue, but couldn't find the ammunition. Hayes spoke up. The ceremony is in 4 days. Your parents have confirmed attendance. They specifically asked if there would be photos for their church newsletter. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. Of course they did. Sometimes, Reed said slowly, silence isn't humility, it's permission. The same words echoed in the small office, hanging between us like a challenge. Permission for what, sir? For people to write your story for you, to decide who you are without your input. He moved back to the window, watching an F-16 taxi past. You've been giving your family permission to erase you. Captain, I'm just trying to keep the peace. You're a combat pilot. Peace is what happens after you've won. He turned back to me. The question is, are you going to keep letting them win by default? I stood there, feeling something shift inside my chest. All these years, I'd thought silence was strength, was taking the high road, but maybe it was just fear dressed up as dignity. Sir, even if I spoke up, they wouldn't believe, then make them. Reed's words were simple, final. Stop asking for recognition, command it. Hayes stood, signaling the meeting's end. Crawford, you've got simulator time in an hour. Dismissed. I saluted and turned to leave, but Reed's voice stopped me at the door. Captain, that night in Syria, I read the full report. 3 surface-to-air missiles locked onto you. Your co-pilot was screaming to abort. What did you say? I remembered the moment perfectly, the alarms shrieking, death reaching up from the ground with bright fingers. I said, not today, sir. Why? Because those soldiers were counting on me. Because running wasn't an option. Reed nodded slowly. Your parents are just another kind of missile lock. Captain, maybe it's time you stopped running from them too. I left the office and walked to the hangar, where my helicopter sat waiting scarred, patched, but still flight-ready. I ran my hand along its hull, feeling the dents from that Syrian sandstorm, the patches where bullets had tried to bring us down. This machine and I had refused to quit when it mattered most. Standing alone in that hangar, I whispered to myself what I should have said at that dinner table. You don't have to shout to be heard, but you do have to speak. The morning of the ceremony rehearsal arrived wrapped in typical Florida heat, the kind that made dress uniforms feel like portable saunas. My parents had arrived early, Dad wearing his old veteran's cap like a badge of authority, Mom dressed in her Sunday best with pearls that caught the light. They stood in the base conference room among other families, already holding court. This is such an honor, Mom was telling Colonel Hayes's wife, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness. We're so proud of Lena for working her way up through the administrative ranks. She's always been good at computers. You know, not combat material, of course, but everyone has their strengths. I stood in the doorway, invisible for the moment, watching her reduce my career to typing skills. Mrs. Hayes looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between my mother and the door where I stood. I thought Captain Crawford was a pilot, she said carefully. Mom laughed, that tinkling sound that preceded every dismissal. Oh, she has her license, yes, but it's mostly transport duties, moving supplies. Very important for logistics, I'm sure. I stepped into the room, and Mom brightened. There she is, Lena. I was just telling everyone about your computer work. Mom, I kept my voice neutral, professional. Around us, other officers and their families were gathering for the rehearsal briefing. I don't work in IT. Well, logistics, administration, it's all office work, really. She turned to the growing audience. She gets that from me, attention to detail. Her father and brother got the warrior genes. Dad chuckled from across the room where he was examining a display of squadron patches. Can't all be door kickers. Right, someone's got to handle the paperwork. A few nervous laughs rippled through the room. Most of the officers knew exactly what I did, but none seemed willing to correct my parents. The silence felt like agreement. Captain Crawford. General Reed entered, his presence immediately shifting the room's energy. Everyone straightened, the casual chatter dying. He looked directly at me, then at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, thank you for coming. His tone was perfectly professional, giving nothing away. We'll begin the rehearsal shortly. Captain, a word. I followed him to the corner of the room, aware of my mother's whispered commentary behind us about how nice it was that the general knew my name. Your parents seem to have an interesting perspective on your service, he said quietly. They see what they want to see, sir. And you let them. It wasn't a question. During the actual ceremony, there will be a citation read, the full citation. Details of the Syria mission, the casualties you prevented, the enemy fire you took. They'll hear it all. They'll find a way to minimize it, sir. They always do. Reed studied me with those steady eyes. Perhaps they'll finally understand what their daughter actually does. He paused. The question is, will you let them continue their narrative afterward? Before I could answer, the rehearsal coordinator called everyone to attention. We walked through the ceremony procedures, where to stand, when to salute, how the presentation would proceed. My parents paid half attention. Mom more interested in identifying important people to network with. Dad comparing medals on various uniforms and finding them wanting compared to his generation. During a break, I overheard Dad talking to another veteran. These new medals, they give them out like candy now. Back in my day, you had to bleed for them. Now file the right paperwork, fly a few supply runs, and boom, you're a hero. The other veteran, a retired major, frowned. I don't think that's quite accurate. Trust me. Dad cut him off. I know my daughter's record. She's done good work, safe work, important for the war effort, sure, but it's not like she's been in actual combat. I felt the familiar burn in my chest, but this time it was different. General Reed was watching from across the room, his expression unreadable. His words echoed, "Stop asking for recognition, command it." But not yet, not here. The ceremony would come, and with it, the truth they'd been so determined to avoid. That night, I went to the hangar alone. The base was quiet, most personnel off duty, just the security lights casting long shadows between the aircraft. I found my helicopter, ran my hands along the fuselage where Syrian bullets had left their marks. The mechanics had wanted to paint over them, but I'd refused. These scars were proof. You don't have to shout to be heard, I whispered to the empty hangar, practicing words I might never say, but silence isn't working anymore. Tomorrow, my parents would sit in the front row and watch their administrator daughter receive one of the highest honors in military aviation. They'd hear the citation, the details of a mission they'd never bothered to ask about. Maybe they'd finally understand, or maybe they'd find new ways to diminish it, to fold it into their narrative of Lena the desk jockey, Lena the safe choice, Lena the disappointment who couldn't measure up to their warrior ideals. I left the hangar and drove home through empty streets, the weight of tomorrow pressing down like the humidity. Either way, after tomorrow, the silence would be broken, the truth would be spoken, even if they refused to hear it. But I was done being complicit in my own erasure. General Reed was right. It was time to stop giving them permission to make me small. 3 weeks after the ceremony, my parents threw another barbecue at their coastal home. The invitation came through Mom's usual group text. Celebrating our family's military service. Bring your stories. I almost declined. But something in General Reed's voice when he accepted my father's invitation changed my mind. I'll be there, Captain, he'd said simply when I mentioned it. Sometimes the best lessons are taught outside the classroom. The humid evening wrapped around me as I arrived, the familiar smell of charcoal and citronella candles mixing with the salt air from the bay. The yard was fuller than usual neighbors, veterans from Dad's VFW post, several officers from the base. Mom had outdone herself. Paper lanterns strung between the palm trees, tables laden with food, her good china brought out for the occasion. Lena! Dad's voice boomed across the yard. He was already several beers in, holding court by the grill. Come here, want you to meet some people. I navigated through the crowd, accepting congratulations on my recent medal from people who didn't quite understand what it was for. Mom had told everyone about the ceremony, of course, but her version involved recognition for excellent service rather than anything specific. "This is my daughter," Dad announced to a group of younger veterans. "Just got decorated last week. Administrative excellence." He winked at them. "Not all heroes wear combat boots." "Right." The group chuckled politely. One of them, a young sergeant with an Afghanistan deployment patch, looked confused. "I heard Captain Crawford flew rescue ops." "Transport," Dad corrected firmly. "Moving supplies, personnel, important work." He clapped my shoulder. "We can't all be door kickers." I spotted General Reed across the yard, sitting quietly at one of the tables, observing. He was in civilian clothes, khakis, and a simple polo, but his bearing was unmistakable. He caught my eye and nodded slightly. The evening progressed with its usual rhythm. Stories of military service flew thick and fast, each one more embellished than the last. Dad told his favorite story about a bar fight in the Philippines, earning laughs and backslaps. The alcohol flowed freely, voices growing louder as the sun set over the water. Then Evan arrived. My brother strutted through the gate like he owned the place, still wearing his Marine Reserve uniform from weekend drill. "Sorry I'm late," he announced. "Had to finish up some tactical planning." He grabbed a beer and immediately launched into a story about convoy operations in Kuwait, making his supply runs sound like special operations missions. "That's my boy," Dad beamed. "Real military bearing on this one." Mom appeared at my elbow. "You should tell them about your ceremony, honey, in your own words." "What's to tell?" Evan interrupted, already 3 drinks in despite just arriving. "They give those medals out for all kinds of things now." Hell, Lena got one for flying supplies between bases. The yard had grown quieter, people sensing the tension. I stood there, counting breaths again, feeling the familiar weight of their diminishment. "It was a distinguished flying cross," someone said. I turned to see the young sergeant from earlier. "That's not a participation trophy." Evan snorted. "Yeah, well, they probably lowered the standards. I mean, when was the last time the Air Force saw real combat? What did you do? Lena fly through some bad weather?" The laughter that followed felt different this time. Meaner, more pointed. Mom tried to deflect, talking about how proud they were of all their children's service. But the damage was done. I was once again the punchline to my own family's joke. "Interesting perspective. Sergeant Crawford." General Reed's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. He hadn't raised it, hadn't moved from his seat, but suddenly he had everyone's attention. Evan puffed up. "So, just calling it like I see it, sir. No offense to my sister, but there's a difference between real combat and what?" Reed stood slowly, deliberately, flying a damaged helicopter through a sandstorm under enemy fire to extract wounded soldiers. The yard went silent except for the distant sound of waves against the shore. "I'm sorry." Evan's bravado flickered. Reed walked closer, each step measured. "I asked what the difference is between real combat and what your sister did, because I was one of the soldiers she pulled out of that crash site. So were 11 others. We'd been shot down, surrounded, taking casualties. The weather was so bad, 3 rescue attempts had already been aborted." My father's beer bottle hung forgotten in his hand. Mom's mouth opened slightly, no words coming out. But Captain Crawford Ghost Hawk 1 came anyway. "Flew through conditions that should have been impossible, took 3 missile locks, sustained significant damage to her aircraft, and still managed to land in a hot zone to get us out." Reed turned to face my parents directly. "Your daughter saved my life. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here. Neither would 11 other soldiers. So when you laugh at her service, you're laughing at the woman who brought me home to my family." The silence that followed was deafening. Evan's smirk had vanished. Dad's face had gone pale. Mom's hand covered her mouth. Reed wasn't finished. "Every veteran at this table has served honorably. But tonight, you're mocking someone who exemplifies the very best of military service courage, skill, and selflessness. And the tragedy is, she's let you do it for years because she values your approval more than your respect." He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw not pity but understanding. "Captain Crawford, thank you again for Syria. Enjoy your evening." He saluted me a full, formal salute in my parents' backyard, and every veteran present followed suit without hesitation. The silence stretched across the yard like a held breath. Every face turned toward me, waiting. My parents stood frozen, their carefully constructed narrative shattered on the ground between us. Evan's mouth worked soundlessly. His Marine bravado evaporated into the humid air. General Reed remained at attention, his salute unwavering. The other veterans held theirs too. The young sergeant, 2 retired Navy chiefs, an old Army colonel who'd been Dad's drinking buddy for years. They all stood there, saluting me in my parents' backyard, while my family looked on in stunned disbelief. I returned the salute slowly, properly, then let my hand fall. "Sir," I said to Reed, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "Thank you." He lowered his hand, gave me one more nod, then moved back to his seat. The other veterans followed suit, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The yard that had been filled with laughter and mockery now hummed with uncomfortable tension. Dad was the first to try to speak. We didn't. Lena never said." "No," I interrupted, finding my voice at last. "I never said, that's true." Mom stepped forward, her face flushed. "Honey, why didn't you tell us we had no idea you were in actual danger?" "You never asked." The words came out quiet but clear. "You decided who I was the day I joined the Air Force. Desk jockey, administrator, safe choice. Every time I tried to tell you different, you had a joke ready, a dismissal prepared." "That's not fair," Evan protested, but his voice lacked its usual force. "You could have what bragged shown you the mission reports, the medal citations." I looked at each of them in turn. "Would you have believed me, or would you have found a way to make it small? Like you always do?" The young sergeant from earlier spoke up. "Captain, I've heard about that Syria mission. 3 separate insurgent positions, visibility near 0, and you still went in." "That takes balls," finished one of the Navy chiefs, an older woman who'd been quiet all evening. "More than most of us have." Dad sank into a chair, his veteran's cap sliding askew. "Ghost Hawk 1, he muttered, like he was tasting the words. "They called you that. They still do," Reed said quietly. "In certain circles, that call sign carries more weight than any rank." "But she never—" Mom's voice trailed off, her hands twisting together. "At Christmas, when we were talking about Evan's deployment, she just sat there, listening to you praise him for organizing supply runs in the Green Zone," I said, "while I'd just come back from a night extraction under fire in Afghanistan." "But his story was the one you wanted to hear." Evan's face had gone red. "You're making us sound like—" "Like what? Like people who spent years telling everyone your sister was playing soldier from behind a desk." Reed's voice cut in again. "Like family who couldn't see past their own assumptions." "We're proud of her," Dad said weakly. "We've always been proud." "Of what?" I asked. "Of my administrative excellence, my computer skills, my safe choices." Each phrase came out sharper than the last. "You've been proud of a daughter who doesn't exist, one you invented because the real one didn't fit your image of military service." The young sergeant shifted uncomfortably. "Captain Crawford, we should probably—" "No," I said, still looking at my family. "They should hear this. Do you know what it's like to come home with bruised ribs from wrestling damaged controls through enemy fire, and listen to your father joke about real soldiers, to have your mother tell the neighbors you work in logistics while you're washing Afghan dust out of your flight suit?" Mom's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't know, because knowing would have meant seeing me, really seeing me, and that was too hard. Wasn't it easier to keep me in the box you'd built safe? Soft, administrative Lena who couldn't possibly measure up to Dad's war stories or Evan's weekend warrior adventures." "Hey," Evan started to protest, but Reed cut him off with a look. "Sergeant Crawford, how many combat missions have you flown?" Evan's mouth opened, then closed. That's not... "My MOS doesn't zero," Reed said flatly. "Your sister has flown 43. 43 times she's put herself between death and American soldiers. But please, tell us more about your tactical planning." The fight went out of Evan like air from a punctured tire. He slumped against the table, his uniform suddenly looking like a costume. Dad finally looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw him actually see me. 43. 44 as of last month, I said quietly. "Night extraction in Kandahar. 3 wounded, 1 critical. Made it back with half my tail rotor shot off." "Jesus," someone whispered. Dad's hands shook as he reached for his beer, then thought better of it. Christ. Lena, we could have lost you." "You did lose me," I said, the truth falling between us like a blade. "Years ago. You just never noticed." The waves crashed against the shore in the distance, the only sound in a yard full of people struggling to breathe through the weight of revelation. My family stood there, stripped of their comfortable narrative, forced to face the daughter they'd never bothered to know. And for the first time in my life, I didn't try to make it easier for them. The power of silence shifted in that moment. It no longer hid me, it commanded the room. Every eye remained fixed on our family's tableau of revelation, waiting for what would come next. The humidity seemed to press harder, making each breath deliberate, conscious. Dad's mouth worked, trying to form words that wouldn't come. His weathered hands, the hands that had fixed aircraft for 20 years, trembled against the table. "Lena, we should have what?" My voice came out steady, controlled. Years of military bearing served me now. Asked, listened, believed. "That's not fair," Mom whispered, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "How could we know if you never—" "I tried." The words cut through her protest. "Remember Thanksgiving 3 years ago, I started to tell you about a mission. You changed the subject to Evan's promotion to corporal. Christmas before that, you interrupted me to ask why I wasn't dating anyone. Said I needed to stop being so focused on my little job." The neighbors and veterans had begun to drift away, giving us space. But General Reed remained, a steady presence at the table's edge. His silence felt like support, like the wingman I'd never had at these family gatherings. "You raised her to serve," Reed said quietly, his words dropping into the charged air like precision munitions. "Then mocked her for how she chose to do it." Dad flinched as if struck. "I never mocked real soldiers, door kickers, desk jockey, administrator." Reed recited each phrase with clinical precision. "Your words, Mr. Crawford, I heard them myself. Tonight, at the ceremony rehearsal, every time I've encountered your family at base events. We were proud," Mom started. "Of a fiction," I said. "Of some safe, sanitized version of me that let you sleep at night. That fit your narrative." Mom could tell her church friends I was doing important support work. Dad could maintain his status as the family's real warrior. Evan could be the one carrying on the combat tradition. Evan hadn't spoken in minutes, standing there in his perfectly pressed reserves uniform that had never seen a combat zone. "Lena, I didn't mean what to diminish my service every chance you got to make jokes about Air Force standards while you spent your deployment in an air-conditioned office in Kuwait." The anger I'd swallowed for years finally had a voice. "You know what I was doing while you were organizing those supply runs you loved to brag about flying into Helmand Province at 2 a.m. to extract Marines who'd been ambushed. Your brothers. But sure, tell everyone how tough your PowerPoint presentations were." "That's enough," Dad said weakly, but there was no authority in it anymore. "No," I said. "It's not enough. It's never been enough. General Reed is right, you raised me to serve, then punished me for it every time I came home. Made me small. Made my service small. until I started believing it myself. I turned to Reed. You asked me once why I never spoke up. This is why. Because they'd already decided who I was, and fighting it felt like fighting family. And now, Reed asked. I looked at my parents, at Evan, at the people who should have been my strongest supporters but had become my harshest critics. Now I'm done asking for permission to be who I am, Mom sobbed quietly. We failed you. Yes, I said simply. You did. Dad stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the patio stones. For a moment, I thought he would storm off, retreat into anger as he so often did when challenged. Instead, he did something I'd never seen before. He saluted me, not the casual, half-mocking salute he sometimes threw around at his VFW meetings. A proper, formal military salute, the kind he'd given superior officers for 20 years. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw something breaking pride, shame, recognition, loss, all tangled together. Captain Crawford, he said, his voice thick. I'm sorry. For all of it. One by one, the remaining veterans at the party followed suit. Even Evan, after a long moment, raised his hand to his brow. They stood there in my parents' backyard, finally seeing me not as the weak link in a military family, but as what I'd always been, a warrior who'd chosen a different battlefield, who'd fought in shadows while they celebrated lesser victories in daylight. That's the thing about respect, I said, my voice carrying across the yard. You don't need to know everything to give it. You just need to see the person in front of you. I returned their salutes, held it for a moment, then let my hand fall. The formality dissolved, leaving us standing there in the ruins of years of misunderstanding. Mom reached for me, her hand stopping short of my arm. Can you forgive us? I looked at her tear-streaked face, at Dad's shattered expression, at Evan's deflated posture. My family, flawed, blind, but still mine. I don't know, I said honestly, but maybe we can start with you actually seeing me. The real me, Ghost Hawk 1, Captain Lena Crawford, your daughter who flies into hell and brings people home. The waves continued their endless rhythm against the shore, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter passed overhead, the sound of my world intersecting with theirs. Finally, honestly, without pretense or diminishment, for the first time in my life, I stood in my parents' house as exactly who I was, and that was enough. The party had dissolved into uncomfortable silence, guests filtering away with mumbled excuses and avoided eye contact. Within 20 minutes, only the core remained my family, General Reed, and the weight of truth finally spoken. I walked away from them all, drawn to the edge of my parents' property where the lawn met the seawall. The dock stretched into the dark water, the same wooden planks I'd run across as a child, dreaming of flight. Now I stood at its end, the distinguished flying cross in my pocket. I'd been carrying it since the ceremony, unable to leave it at home, unable to wear it here, until now. Footsteps on the weathered boards. I didn't turn, but I knew from the measured pace it was Reed. Hell of a thing, Crawford, he said, stopping beside me, speaking truth to family. Should have done it years ago. No, his voice carried certainty. It happened exactly when it needed to. You weren't ready before, neither were they. Behind us, fireworks suddenly erupted over the bay, some celebration down the coast, probably a beach resort's weekly show. The explosions painted the sky in gold and silver, their light reflecting off the black water in fractured patterns, like flares over a combat zone, but beautiful instead of terrifying. You didn't need me to speak for you, Reed said quietly. You had all the words. You just needed someone to create the space for them. You did more than that, sir. You turned the world right side up. He was quiet for a moment, watching the fireworks bloom and fade. No, Captain, you did that yourself, the moment you stopped giving them permission to diminish you. I just held up a mirror. I pulled the medal from my pocket, its weight familiar now, Earned. The ribbon caught the firework light, the bronze cross gleaming. 44 missions, I said, and the one that mattered most was in my parents' backyard. The hardest battles usually are. More footsteps on the dock, hesitant, uncertain. I turned to see my father approaching, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He'd removed his veteran's cap, holding it in both hands like a peace offering. "Lena," he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Captain Crawford, He looked at Reed, then back to me. "I don't know how to fix this. 20 years of getting it wrong. Of getting you wrong." "You can't fix it," I said simply. "But you can do better. Start seeing who I am, not who you wanted me to be." He nodded, his eyes dropping to the metal in my hand. May I see it?" I handed it over, watching his fingers trace the cross, the ribbon. When he looked up, tears tracked down his weathered face. "I should have been there, really been there, not just present, but, Christ, Lena, I should have seen you." "You see me now." "Yeah," he whispered. "I do. Ghost Hawk 1. My daughter, the hero I was too blind to recognize." Mom and Evan had followed, standing at the dock's entrance like they needed permission to approach. I nodded, and they came forward slowly. Mom's makeup was ruined, her perfect composure shattered. Evan had removed his uniform jacket, standing in just his undershirt, the pretense finally stripped away. "The things we said," Mom began, "the way we made you feel. Lena, how do we come back from that?" "We don't come back," I said. "We go forward. Different. Honest. Actually seeing each other for the first time." The fireworks reached their finale, explosions cascading across the sky in rapid succession. In their light, I saw my family clearly flawed, humbled, but still mine. And they saw me not the administrator, not the desk jockey, not the safe choice. They saw Captain Lena Crawford, decorated combat pilot. Ghost Hawk 1. Reed stepped back, giving us the moment. "Captain, I'll leave you with your family." He saluted once more, crisp and respectful. "It's been an honor serving with you." "Thank you, sir, for everything." He walked back toward the house, leaving us four standing at the end of the dock. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility, of words finally spoken, of truth finally acknowledged. "So," Dad said eventually, his voice rough, 44 missions. Would you tell us about them? Really tell us." I looked at him, at all of them. These people who'd made me small for so long but were finally ready to see me as large as life. "Yeah," I said. "I think I'd like that." We stood there as the smoke from the fireworks drifted across the water, the night air carrying the scent of sulfur and sea salt. I held my medal up to the moonlight, its surface catching the glow, and felt the weight of silence lift from my shoulders. Not the silence of hiding the silence of strength, of choosing when to speak and when to let actions define you. I'd found my voice in my parents' backyard, not through shouting or anger, but through finally refusing to be erased. General Reed had been right. I hadn't needed him to speak for me. I just needed to stop giving others permission to write my story. The waves lapped against the pier posts below, and somewhere out in the darkness, a helicopter traced its path across the sky, someone else flying through the night, bringing people home. Just like I'd done 44 times. Just like I'd finally done for myself tonight. This was my story. I owned it now. And that silence at the end, that wasn't surrender or hiding anymore. It was peace. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect across the miles. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to hear more, and I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts about family, recognition, and finding your voice. What moments spoke to you? Share your own experiences below.